Hello friends, every year Canadians spend more on law enforcement, police, prosecutors, courts, prison, payroll, all of it paid for out of the same tax dollar. But almost none of us ever see the full bill. So today I want to try something different, not a debate about whether the system should be bigger or smaller, but a straight up audit. What is Canadian law enforcement actually costing us? Who is picking up the tab? And for the price we're paying, what are we actually getting? So let's dive in. So the big question is, law enforcement is the most expensive line item most Canadians never audit or see. It's funded by three different levels of government: federal, provincial, and municipal, and none of them carry the total bill on their own, which means when the system costs more every year, the question isn't just is it worth it, it is who is it actually costing. So let's look at the cost. Let's start with the three of the biggest visible numbers here. The policing operating cost in 2022-23 came to $19.7 billion. That's every police service in Canada, from the RCMP down to small town municipal forces combined. Correctional Services Canada, the federal prison system, ran about $3 billion. And the legal aid across every province and territory added roughly $1.1 billion. That's before we count courts, before we count provincial corrections, before we count the public prosecution service or the federal Department of Justice. So who pays this $19.7 billion policing bill? Of that $19.17 billion policing bill, who actually pays? Based on long-running federal, provincial, municipal split that Statistic Canada has tracked through the Police Administration Survey, the picture is pretty stark. Roughly 60% of the policing bill, about $11.8 billion, is paid by municipality. That's your city, your town, or the region. Another 30%, about $5.9 billion, is paid by the province and territories, mostly for the OPP in Ontario and police forces in Quebec, the RNC in Newfoundland, and RCMP contract policing cost in the rest of the country. And only about 10%, $2 billion, lands on the federal government for the RCMP's federal mandate: organized crime, national security, federal enforcement. Which means the biggest single funder of Canadian policing isn't the federal government or the provincial government, it's the property tax base of the Canadian cities, the municipalities. Now let's follow the money, the full enforcement stack. Policing is the biggest line item, as I mentioned, but it isn't the only one. Once you follow the full enforcement stack, you see the money moving in three parallel streams. Your federal taxes pay for the RCMP's federal mandate, Correctional Service Canada, the Payroll Board, the Federal Department of Justice, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, the federal courts, and Public Safety Canada, which funds things like the CBSA and the CSIS. Your provincial taxes pay for provincial and superior courts, crown prosecutors, provincial corrections, which hold most remand inmates and short sentences. The top up on legal aid and the provincial attorney general ministries that run the whole system. And your property taxes, the money you pay to the city as a property owner fund municipal police services directly. The takeaway: police consume the largest single share, courts and corrections are the second and third largest, nothing else come close. Now let's look at the structure. A few structural facts worth noting is that Canada has 71,472 police officers as according to May 2023 statistic. That about 178 officers for every 100,000 people, roughly in line with the long run average and the lower than most G7 peers, which sounds reasonable. All three levels of government fund every stage of the system: arrest, prosecution, adjudication, correction, and payroll. And just over half of all legal aid spending goes to criminal matters. The rest is civil, family, and immigration. So when you see the enforcement stack, it's really a 4-step policing, which it's more than 70% of the operating bill, then prosecution, and then courts, and the correction and payroll. Here's where it gets interesting for the tax policy purpose. In 2022-2023, nominal policing spending grew by 6.4% year over year. That sounds like a lot, but after you strip out inflation, real rate per capita policing spending actually fell by about half a percentage point. The system essentially kept pace with inflation, no more, no less. So the spending is exploding, narrative isn't quite right. The nominal number keeps climbing, but in real dollars, the policing bill is roughly flat. The deeper problem is what the top dollar is buying, because the caseload, the number of criminal cases the system actually finishes, hasn't kept up. This is the shape of Canadian criminal justice in 4 numbers. 2.23 million, that's the number of criminal code incidents reported to the police in 2022, everything from mischief to homicide. 34%, that's the national clearance rate, meaning out of those 2.23 million incidents, police identified a suspect and laid charges or cleared the file by other means in about 1 in 3 cases. 760,000, that's roughly how many incidents actually got cleared. And 100,000, that's how many cases ended with a guilty finding in adult criminal court that same year. So here's the math. For every 22 incidents reported to the police in Canada, about 1 ends in a guilty verdict. The rest drop out along the way. Unfounded, unresolved, stayed, withdrawn, diverted, acquitted, or is still sitting in the backlog for various reasons. Here are the case for justified increased cost in the policing system. And why do its defenders say rising spending is worth it? Let's look at the Chiefs of Police Association argue that modern investigation, digital evidence, organized crime, server crime simply require capacity that didn't exist a decade ago. Cases are more complex and complexity costs money, which is true. Moderate criminologists point out that in real dollars, per capita policing spending is essentially flat. The nominal number is misleading. Inflation, population growth, and the wage bargaining eat most of it. That's also partially true. And victim services advocate pushback on using conviction rate as the only scorecard. Clearance conviction numbers exclude the support that prevent reoffending, the mental health calls, the domestic violence intervention. The system produces outcomes that never show up in court statistic, which is also true. And here is the other side, what the opponent says. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, the non-partisan independent watchdog, has repeatedly flagged that criminal justice spending growth outpaces most other provincial and federal program lines. Think tanks like the Fraser Institute and the C.D. Howe Institute have published commentary arguing that cost per case and the court delay trends deserve far more public scrutiny than they get. And the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has warned for years that policing costs are crowding out other local services on the same property tax base, such as libraries, recreation, road maintenance, climate adoption, etc. So the data lines up with the concerns. Adult court caseload is down about 32% since 2018-2019. Clearance rates are stuck near 1/3. Real per capita spending is flat, which means the marginal case, the next case the system takes on, is getting more expensive, not cheaper. And the taxpayers most exposed to that rising cost are the ones paying the municipal property taxes. Now, let's do the math. This one is illustrative, not exact, because it's hard to get the actual numbers in totality from any one sources. But the order of magnitude matters. Add up the visible criminal justice envelope, which is the federal, provincial, and municipal, and you land somewhere between $27 and $29 billion a year. Divide by 100,000 guilty findings that we mentioned before, adult courts produced in 2022-2023, and you get a system-wide cost of roughly $270,000 per guilty finding. Now that denominator is deliberately narrow. It excludes diversion programs, youth court outcomes, victim services, and every case that ends without a conviction. If we broaden the denominator, the per outcome cost falls, obviously, but the trend doesn't. Whatever the denominator you pick, guilty findings, the total court disposition, cleared incidents, spending is climbing faster than the output. On the other hand, the cost per outcome is rising. In other words, deterrence, victim services, organized crime capacity, and community response times are all real goods. So who are the winners or losers, or risk bearers, may I say? On the winner side, the federal government gets off the lightest. It's responsible for only about 10% of the policing bill, and most of the visible growth is pushed down to provinces and municipalities. Police service payroll is the largest single cost category, and it keeps growing with collective bargaining settlements, private security and technology vendors, body cameras, digital evidence platforms, record management system are in a long expansion cycle. And specialized federal units for cyber and organized crime have quietly become some of the fastest growing line item in the policing spending. On the risk bearer side or loser side, it's more straightforward, really. Municipality property taxpayers carry about 60% of the national policing bill. Accused persons who don't qualify for legal aid absorb rising private defense costs. Victims wait longer for cases to resolve as court backlogs grow. And every other local service that competes for the same property tax dollar, such as the housing, transit, parks, climate, gets squeezed by this policing cost. So here is the final verdict. Canadians spend more on law enforcement every single year. The system finishes fewer cases than it did 5 years ago even. That is not a scandal on its own. The system is complicated, inflation is real, and some of what policing produces never shows up in courtroom. But a 5-year trend in the wrong direction, more dollars, fewer outcomes, is not something any other public program would be allowed to sustain without answering hard questions. So when you pay your next municipality taxes or file your income tax return, ask yourself, is bill paying for safer country or a larger system? Are you feel more safer? Or do you see it's more efficient? What is missing? Please drop your comments, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.